going to go live now to mayoral candidate Brad Bradford, who's making an announcement. Let's listen in.
All right. Everyone good to go? Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. On March 20th, 2023, a 21-year-old man was murdered in broad daylight at 4 o'clock in the afternoon in the parking lot of Fairview Mall on a busy Saturday. One of the individuals apprehended and charged with this murder was also arrested in February of 2021 on firearm charges, possession of stolen property in excess of $5,000, and in possession of Schedule I drugs for the purposes of trafficking. He failed to comply with the terms of his release order. And as we all know too well and continue to grieve, in March, a 16-year-old, a teenage boy, was murdered in an unprovoked attack by a 25-year-old man of no fixed address, only weeks after having been sentenced to a 2-year probation order for sexual assault. The accused had an extensive criminal history here in Ontario, including 20 different charges for sexual assault, assaulting a police officer, mischief for damaging an ankle monitor, assaulting and uttering threats. When it comes to policing bail, Toronto's grade is unequivocally a fail. We need less talk and more action to do something about this. And the question has to be asked, why does this keep happening? The answer is very simple. Hardly any of the 17 Toronto police divisions employ police officers whose sole job is to ensure that people out on bail abide by their court-mandated orders. Of the 44 gun-related murders in Toronto last year, 17 of those arrested and charged with these homicides were on bail at the time that they were committed, 7 of them for firearms-related offenses. This system is failing, and violent offenders know it. Nobody is watching to ensure that they comply with the law. So what's the solution? Every time this happens, politicians call on the federal government to move on bail reform. It's not quite thoughts and prayers, but if we're being honest, it's not too far from it either. I've done it too, because the federal government needs to be a part of the solution. But there's also room for less talk and more action. As mayor, I will establish dedicated bail compliance units by working with the Toronto Police Service to keep tabs on alleged criminals who the courts have released into our community. This is a critical expansion of Toronto's community policing presence, with 68 new officers across Toronto's 17 police divisions. These bail compliance units would be tasked exclusively with engaging, monitoring, deterring, and enforcing compliance of the law with individuals in the community released on bail. Torontonians should expect their elected officials at all levels of government to prioritize their safety and their security. Yesterday's leaders who built the status quo are not the answer. We need real action today to restore the safety to our communities, and I want to bring action to City Hall, be a strong mayor of leadership, and to hold people accountable and to get the job done. Toronto, we can and will do better, and we will make our community safer for everybody. I'm happy to take any of your questions. Well, I think we make it very clear to the police board, and they are well aware of the issue with bail enforcement. We see it week after week here in the city. We need to stand up a bail compliance unit to make sure that we have the resources available to do those checks to stop the continuation of crime before it happens. So, we'll have that conversation with the police board. I think it's also very important to other levels of government as well, and we all need to come to the table to come to ground on this. We will be securing the funding to stand up a program to hire the additional resources, 68 officers across the 17 divisions to stand up a bail compliance unit. I think that's really important. I'm sure the police board would understand that. And you know what? In putting this policy together, I've talked to superintendents, I've talked to inspectors, I've talked to staff sergeants, and I've talked to constables, and they all agree this is needed right now in Toronto.
68 officers is a huge amount of resources. A starting cop makes $100,000 plus as much in benefits and other things. How much would that cost, and how do you pay for it when the city has a $1.5 billion budget?
So we anticipate the program will be $16 million in the first year. That includes $5.1 million in annual costs for salary and benefits, $3.6 million annual costs for fleet and support, and a $7 million cost to stand up the program for the first time. So that's the ballpark number. 4 officers on average per division, 17 divisions. And, you know, the Premier has been clear time and time again that community safety is a priority. The Premier has spoken about that extensively during this election. And when I'm elected mayor, I will sit down at the table with the Premier to have this conversation about how we're going to stand up this much needed program of bail compliance units here in the city of Toronto. Yes, this would be 68 additional officers. There is a cost associated with that, as I've just outlined very specifically. But again, community safety has to be a priority. We have this challenge with the justice of the peace in the provincial jurisdiction, and with all the conditions that are imposed on alleged offenders who are out on bail. But we do not have the resources to enforce that. And time again, the system fails Torontonians, as we see with repeat offenders who are involved in very serious offenses. And the Toronto police do not have the resources to do the bail enforcement. And that's why we need a dedicated bail compliance unit. And I would imagine, you know, the Premier would be very interested in making sure that those resources are in place to keep our community safe and support the Toronto police in that effort.
Somebody could be out on bail and compliant with all the conditions and then suddenly commit a random attack. How would these officers stop something like that?
Right now, we do not have the resources in place to adequately enforce the restrictions imposed with bail. And so there should be a lot more work done on that front. And we see time and time again, people are not complying with the restrictions imposed as part of bail. And so having a dedicated resource unit to do that would improve the situation. Is it going to be a panacea to make sure that this never happens again? No, but it is a real concrete step that we could take today, and as a mayor that I would take here in Toronto to improve the situation.
Names this morning right here, campaign and the Saunders campaign seemingly are taking shots at one another. Is this another attempt at saying
What I'm doing right now is responding to a community safety crisis here in the city of Toronto. And as a mayor, I will be committed to less talk and more action. It's one thing to call for a meeting with the Prime Minister. We saw the premiers months ago, all 13, write a letter. Council is engaged in that as well. The letter writing campaigns are over. We are going to take real action, and that's why this is a real proposal to stand up something that would make a tangible improvement for community safety here in Toronto.
Critics will say that this is just over-policing and that's not the strategy this is taking place.
I would point to the hundreds of folks who have committed infractions, serious violent offenses, well on bail. I would point to the individuals who are arrested time and time again, reoffending with serious firearm-related offenses. That translates into more crime. And I would say this is a credible response, something that is needed in my conversations and discussions with folks across the city. This needs to be responded to. And we can point to the federal government and ask for bail reform, as we have for years. But the City of Toronto needs to take action in conjunction with the province to stand up a program that responds to the challenges that we're facing right now.
Itself is based on the presumption of innocence. How much power will these compliance officers have? You can't surveil people who are, 24 hours a day.
Right now, we're doing a combination of nothing to very little. So these officers will be enforcing the conditions that are imposed with an individual on bail. And that's part of the agreement. When the provincial justice of a peace puts those restrictions in place, the expectation is that they are enforced. Today, very, very often they are not. And that's because the resources don't exist and they're not in place to do that. And time again, we see folks who are out on bail that continue to reoffend, and often it ends up in more violent crime here in Toronto, and people are tired of that, and I am tired of that as well. And as a strong mayor of Action, I'm putting a real proposal on the table to address it.
Is there another example or research that says this would work and that we wouldn't be spending $68 million or whatever it is for little or no result?
Pardon me?
Is there research? Is there something? You're basing this on something, or is this just something you've come up with? Like, is there another example of where that's being done?
There are other jurisdictions that do a far better job enforcing bail conditions than the City of Toronto, and that's because the reality is we have a hard time doing any of that. You know, again, justice of the peace at the province imposes these conditions, but it falls to the Toronto Police to do some of that enforcement. And again, my conversations at the superintendent level, the inspector level, the staff sergeant level, and constables, those resources are not in place to do that. And so if we want to improve community safety outcomes, if we recognize that there is a problem of folks out on bail reoffending in very serious matters, we have to put resources in place to address that.
We've been listening to mayoral candidate Brad Bradford on the campaign trail, announcing that if elected mayor, he will establish a dedicated bail compliance unit to work with Toronto Police to keep tabs on alleged criminals who the courts have released into our community. He would do that by adding 68 new officers to Toronto's police's division.